Introducing our last unit where we take a look at Islamic architecture. Most of our work is going to be on Islamic architecture in the West. We'll be doing some workshops coming up. There's a documentary later in the semester. And all of that is going to focus on Islamic architecture in the West. Before we get there, though, we got to do two things. We got to do today's lecture, which focuses on the early Muslim community and some of the basics of the Muslim faith. The focus today on this early Muslim community is important, ends up being important for architecture and for Muslims in general. For Muslims in general, revere Muhammad and the early Muslim community called the Ummah. The practices established during the time frame we look at today, the receiving of the Quran, which was not received as a single book, but as occasional revelations during this time period, all of this is very formative for contemporary Muslims. And what we will come to see starting next time, looking at classical Islamic architecture and its expressions around the world, you'll start to see themes that emerge, symbolic issues that emerge during this formative period of Islam appearing in Muslim architecture, not only shaping what Muslim architecture can be, how you can decorate your mosque, how you can design your space and display Muslim identity, but also in later arguments among Muslims and defenses by Muslims against criticisms of Islam from opponents. So today we're going to focus on the social context of the early Muslim community, some basic history of the early Muslim community, and then we'll end up looking at some theology. We'll push this a little bit past the death of Muhammad in 632 AD, but not very far. So we're going to skip a lot of things like Islamic dynasties. So we're going to start with the cultural context of the emergence of Islam, look at Muhammad's and the social and theological challenges, some of the ways that Muhammad's message to his people was very different from his cultural context, but at the same time often fell down and became bound up by the rules and the social norms of his context. Take a look at throughout the lecture on the ways that some of these events and ideas that come up in the early Muslim community remain a motif or a theme for later Muslims, some of whom have been bad actors in history. And then we'll end it with the kind of general world religions intro, the 5 pillars of Islam, what they are and what they're comprised of. Islam, global faith, practiced by around 1.7 to 1.8 billion human beings around the world. Most Americans, when they think of Islam, immediately think of Arab culture and would probably stick the heart of Islam or the majority of Muslims somewhere in the Middle East. Other Americans might realize that there are Muslims in North Africa, but that's pretty much the extent. And then they might hear something about Kashmir and Pakistan and India, but they don't know what's going on there. In fact, the largest Muslim majority country by population is not in the Middle East, it's over here in Indonesia. Muslims are sizable minority populations all around the world. If you ask a Muslim, well, are there differences in Islam, the way there's Catholicism and Protestantism, or the way among Protestants there are different denominations? And most Muslims will be like, no, there's no difference. Oh, we're all Muslim. Well, there's divisions. The major division to worry about is the division between what we consider maybe mainstream Islam, called Sunni Muslims. And we'll talk about one slide late in the lecture how this split occurred. And then another branch of Muslims, and that's about 80-85% of the world's Muslims. Another branch of Islam are the Shiites. Shia Islam is a majority religious tradition in only a handful of countries in the world, Iran notably, Iraq, the island nation in the Gulf, Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, Bahrain. There are large concentrations of Shiite Muslims in Lebanon, in Syria. And then there's just a breakdown of other more splinter groups of Muslims elsewhere in the world. Frankly, a growing number of Muslims in the United States are what we would call cultural Muslims. Just like there are Jews, for all intents and purposes, secular atheists, but still observe Hanukkah and still cherish Jewish culture and traditions, but because they were born a Jew. And similarly, there's a growing number, and there's not been studies on this, I wish there were, a growing number of Muslims in the West, in Europe and the United States, who are cultural Muslims. They were born into a Muslim family, they value Muslim traditions, they might do something like my friend Amir, who gives up beer for Ramadan, just to show you, in Islam you should not drink alcohol. So anyway, that's the breakdown of Muslims in the world today. But let's go back into history. Let's start with where we're dealing with, what the location that we're going to talk about a lot today is. And that is the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula today is dominated largely by the country of Saudi Arabia that was formed in the 1700s, as well as Yemen and Oman and Qatar. But at the time, the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th and 7th century was a dry, arid environment. It's surrounded by the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. That means that the coastal areas provides sea breezes, provides aquatic or marine resources. And so when we look at the population in 6th and 7th century, we tend to see that kingdoms and established communities really were more dense along the coast than they were on the interior. In fact, this area right here that I'm circling with our non-functional highlighter is the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. It has the lowest population density even today of anywhere on Earth, even more so than the Gobi Desert of Mongolia and Western China. Early on in the 6th and 7th centuries, major kingdoms, we'll take a look at those in a moment, were clustered on the peninsula itself along the coast, many of which established trading routes with India and also became vassal territories of the Persian Empire to the north. The area we're going to focus on today is what was called, and today is still called, the Hijaz. This is the western coastal region. It's a fairly narrow plain along the coast of the Red Sea. The plain quickly turns, the further inland you travel, the plain quickly turns into hill country and steep mountains before going down the mountains and ending up in that low population density, arid desert environment. At the time, in terms of geopolitics, I showed you this once before when mentioning about the movement after Emperor Constantine of the geopolitical focus and governance of the Roman Empire away from Rome and over to Istanbul, Constantinople. And basically that established this relatively weak frontier. This was an empire that was concentrated here at the Straits of the Bosphorus, the Byzantines. They were relatively weak in what was left of Italy. Italy and Rome itself was frequently under attack or under the political influence of those European tribes that Rome had constantly been fighting against in Europe. But it also left the Byzantines with nominal control of the northern Mediterranean stretches and the southern portion of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, as well as contested control of what we call the Levant, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, eastern portions of Turkey. And they were basically struggling for control with the Sassanids, the Persian Empire of the day. But what you might notice is this orangey color down here, and scholars would debate where to draw the line. But the orangey color down here were a number of Arab kingdoms, or Hashemite kingdoms, in the case of the Ghassanids right here, that were either independent or were nominally vassal states under the military protection and economic tutelage or patronage of the Persians or variously the Byzantines, depending on who seemed to be the stronger person in the area of the day. However, notice down here, all the gray. This area, neither empire really had sway on the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, nor on the Hijaz. However, the Hijaz's economy and population were dependent on trading partners right here. And we'll get to why that matters, particularly for Muhammad. So you end up with this combination of the Byzantines and the Persians, at the time called the Sassanid Empire, to the north, contesting control of the Levant. Below them were several established kingdoms that the first group the Lakhmids, the Oman, Mahra, and Yemen, all of those ended up being beholden economically, dependent on either the Byzantines or the Persians. For Oman, Mahra, and the Lakhmids, their dependency was on the Persian Empire. They were the vassal states on the peninsula. The Ghassanids and Yemen, on the other hand, had long established trading relationship with the Ghassanids. The Ghassanids are the ancestral group that the Kingdom of Jordan today, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan as its official name is, tie themselves to and identify with. The Ghassanids remained relatively neutral in the conflict between the Byzantines and the Persians, and the Ghassanids importantly became a critical trading center because, well, you have the Silk Road coming in across the Persian Empire from China and coming right in here. You also have trade routes coming in from India and Southeast Asia into the Persian Gulf, into the kingdom of the Lakhmids and the Sassanids that end up getting traded in goods with the Ghassanids. And most importantly for us, the Yemenis were trading goods from the coast up coastal trading routes, caravan routes that went straight through the Hijaz and provided an economic lifeline to what was the cultural heart of Islam. Now, beyond those established kingdoms, there were throughout the desert Arabian Peninsula a number of tribal areas, the most important of which, for our purposes, is right here, the Quraysh. Now, for modern Saudi Arabia, the Hanifa became quite important because it was from them that the early founders of the House of Saud, the Saudis, came to establish the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But for us, the tribal group that's most important is the Quraysh. If I could highlight something here, it would be the Quraysh. The Quraysh were the powerhouse tribe for the Hijaz on the western coast of the peninsula, and we'll be talking about them quite a bit. So if we look at where people lived, we know that population was sparse, but population centers across the Arabian Peninsula were connected by trade routes. Trade routes were not only an important economic corridor for the peninsula, they were also in part a determinant. It was kind of a chicken and egg. You ran trade routes where there were population centers because you didn't want to go too long in a desert environment without a place to stay for the night. However, if you notice the direction of most of these population centers, they're kind of swinging upwards. There's a northwestern trajectory from coastal Yemen right here. It's kind of hard to see on the board, but there is a different shading here to the peninsula. And if you look at the population centers, they follow those lines to the northwest. And then over here, this point right here that I'm swinging the mouse cursor around at, which isn't really helpful that it's maybe right here. I'll do the laser pointer. Right here, this is the Gulf. This is the Persian Gulf. So these are coastal trade routes, and then right here in between is a Red Sea trade route here, the Hijaz trade route here, and you can see how that runs just to the west of the mountains. So Yemeni caravan routes running along the Hijaz provided economic opportunity. They provided employment opportunities. And that becomes important because of the changing population profile in the Hijaz in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. What are you doing if you're living on the Hijaz in the late 6th and early 7th centuries? Well, as I said, you had settlements and shaped by the trade routes, but where you lived was also dependent on rainfall. You had limited agriculture. This is a harsh desert environment. And before you had the economic stability of the trade routes and also the spatial fixity, like you know where the trade routes are. So you can settle near the trade route and be relatively prosperous. But before you had that situation, and for the majority of people living on the Hijaz, they didn't live on the trade routes. The majority of people living on what we would call the Bedouin. They were nomadic pastoralists. They practiced herding goats. They valued camels and had limited opportunities for very small scale agriculture. Now, if you lived in a village or a town along the trade route, it was a different story. You were living in essentially what were agricultural oasis villages. You couldn't just set up, okay, there's a trade route, great, but you couldn't just set up stakes, put down your stakes on it next to a trade route and go, okay, we're going to be a successful town. You needed water. You needed some arable land that you could grow crops on. Crops like dates, pomegranates, basically orchards and limited wheat or grain crops in the area. These were not large scale because the area itself, the land, couldn't sustain large scale agriculture, but it was possible combining limited agriculture with the trade routes and taking part in supplying and supporting the caravans that you could make a go of things. And some communities became quite large. I'll talk about those in a moment. But again, majority of the population on the Hijaz were Bedouin, nomadic pastoralists, moving based on the change of the seasons, the availability of water and pasturage for their flocks. More settled populations on the Hijaz lived in towns or small villages near trade routes that had access to water and had limited agricultural activity. Here, for instance, is a 19th century European lithograph of one of those towns, one of the two towns we're going to be worried about today. This is the town of Mecca. The depiction here, if you see, there's this weird structure in the center surrounded by a walled courtyard. Surrounding that structure are the block-style housing that was common to larger towns on the Hijaz and, in fact, throughout the Arabian Peninsula, among the Ghassanids, and other established kingdoms, in Yemen, for instance, as well. If you notice around the town, there's the depiction of hills. What matters for this town's importance is, one, this was the seat of power for the tribe called the Quraysh that I had mentioned earlier. This was where the Quraysh lived and extended their control of out to surrounding territory. Importantly, the fact that the town is in the hills rather than on the coast is significant because the trade route, the caravans had to go out of their way to get to Mecca as this caravan stop. And what scholars argue was the key control for Mecca, the important reason that caravans would go out of their way and that the Quraysh should be acknowledged as this powerful tribe on the Hijaz was this structure and their custodianship of it. We'll get to that in a moment. The other town we worry about today is a town that at the time of the Prophet Muhammad was called Yathrib. Yathrib came to be called Medina, or the city of the Prophet. This was a town on the caravan route north of Mecca. It technically was a cluster of villages near about to each other that was identified by the residents of those villages as well as passing caravan hands and Bedouin as just one settlement, as Yathrib. However, there were several distinct tribal groups claiming each of the villages in this, what we call, as you see on this, I think I put it on the screen, did I? An oasis settlement? No, I didn't use the term, but the term is nucleated settlement. It had these separate cells that were small oasis villages practicing limited agriculture at each village, and each village was associated with a particular tribe, roughly. The interesting thing about Mecca versus Yathrib is that Mecca was much more cosmopolitan. I mean, we are talking about a desert environment, but nevertheless, Mecca was fairly cosmopolitan. It had strong connections both to Yemen and the Ghassanids. People in Mecca that took part in the caravan trade would frequently encounter people from the Byzantine Empire, from the Sassanids. And at that point, that part of the world, if you had interacted with Byzantines, if you had interacted with Persians, you had interacted with people from Yemen and the Ghassanids, the Hashemites, you were pretty cosmopolitan. However, Mecca was seen to have some problems by folks in the Hijaz. First was that Mecca was the place that was attracting the poor. It was attracting the people who had fallen out of favor with their tribe. We'll talk about what that means in just a moment. So Mecca was becoming a place that you could get rich, it maybe, or at least survive because of access to the caravan route. You're from a small village like you could go to Mecca and maybe make something of yourself, especially if your family had problems or reputational problems with tribal honor. But anyway, there's also a sense of disconnect by the Bedouin. The Bedouin were thinking that these folks living in Mecca were a bunch of city slickers. What do they know about authentic Bedouin traditions? So you have this sense of criticism that there was a disconnect between Mecca as this cosmopolitan town on the trade routes versus the surrounding communities. And where some of that comes to play is that everyone, whether you were living in Mecca, Yathrib, or a small Bedouin camp on the Hijaz, or the village at Taif, you were bound by a tribal society. The tribe was the largest political body that you held allegiance to. The tribe was what we call fictive kinship. You may not have had a genetic blood tie to other people in your tribe, but everyone in the tribe believed that they did. And at one point, in 1,000 years before, sometime in the 500 BC, let's say, maybe that was true for the tribe. But over time, through intermarriage, bringing new people into the tribe, through taking people as the spoils of conflict, the spoils of tribal wars, genetics are not really a question of what's binding the tribe together anymore. Now, genetics ultimately bound together clans. Clans would be much more, while everybody in the tribe would be referring to each other as members of the same tribe, as family terms, familial terms. In the clan, what was called the Banu, your relationship, your genetic relationship was much more true among the clan. And within each clan, these were your cousins. These were your second and third, what we call or consider your second and third cousins. And then within each clan, there was a family. Now, at each level of the tribe, at the family level, at the clan, individual level, at the family level, at the clan level, at the tribe level, everyone was bound by the rules of the tribe. What bound you to the rules of the tribe was your sense of honor. Because to maintain your honor meant to maintain your standing in the tribe, and in a harsh desert environment meant to maintain access to resources. If you lost your standing in the tribe, if you murdered someone else from your clan, or you murdered someone or stole something from someone else in another clan in the tribe, that was a serious violation of the law. And if your clan or your family could not pay reparations for that action, then your family was dishonored. And your clan lost honor in the face of other clans in the tribe. Whole tribes could lose honor. Often honor at the tribal level operated in alliances. You needed access to water, you needed access to pasturage as a Bedouin people. And so you would form alliances with other tribes to guarantee peaceful relations with other tribes and thus secure access to resources. And often these alliances would call upon your whole tribe to come to that other tribe's aid if that other tribe was under attack, for instance. And if you did not come to that other tribe's aid, you broke your honor, you soiled your honor. And everyone, then your tribe was subject to attack by your former allies. And of course, within the clan, as I just said, honor functioned as a legal mechanism. It was how you got access to resources, how you maintained your status as a good member of the clan, and thus maintained your access to resources. Where those dispossessed folks ended up in Mecca was when something happened. Some member of their family, their brother, killed someone. Got into a drunken bar fight and killed a man just to watch him die. Sorry, that's Johnny Cash. But you were dishonored by that action. And it might mean that your access to resources in your tribe, in your rural area of the Hijaz, is greatly reduced. And it might behoove you, it might make a better sense for you to go to Mecca and take part in the caravan route. Also, pre-Islamic Arabian religious traditions. Pre-Islamic Arabia is referred to, this time frame in terms of the religious practices of the Arabs, is referred to today by Muslims as the Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance. Also, by the way, we're entering a point where I'm going to note that there are some things that are italic, that have a little asterisk next to them that might be good to write down. And then I might end up leaving the mouse cursor next to something else that's good to write down. So the period of ignorance, people didn't know better. Now the popular assumption has been that the pre-Islamic Arabs were polytheists. They had a variety of deities, and that is true. There was a variety of deities. Some towns would emphasize the worship of some deities over others. However, when we look closer at the theology of these early Arabs and their writings and their poetry, particularly their poetry, we see that they were really kind of like the Greeks, what we call henotheists. Henotheists recognize a rank order of the gods. You know, among the Greeks there was Zeus, and then there were the sons of Zeus, and there were the others that struggled against the ancients and the Titans and so on. But among the Arabs there seems to have been a recognition of a high god, the God, Allah, and then a variety of other deities that were significant, that were ranked, ordered lower than Allah. Now, along the Hijaz at the time, there were 3 deities that received special treatment that had shrines built to them in those towns in the Hijaz. At Taif, Allat, a female deity seen as both the mother of a number of deities and the consort of Allah, had a shrine. Al-Uzza was seen as a kind of an Athena figure, and a warrior, a virgin associated with the Hashemite town of Petra. And Manaf, further north as well, also almost in the Ghassanids kingdom, at Taiki had a shrine, was associated with fate and time and destiny. These 3 were seen as the daughters of Allah. And when Salman Rushdie in the 1980s decided, a former Iranian, then English novelist, decided to write about these 3 daughters of Allah, what Muslims believe were referenced at one time in a false revelation in the Quran, known as the Satanic Verses. It got Mr. Rushdie in significant trouble with the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. But also at the time, there were Christians, there were Jews, there were Zoroastrians, so it's a Persian religious tradition that believed in a high god and Ahura Mazda and his prophet Zarathustra. And so if you were in the caravan trade particularly, and you ended up around Petra trading, you'd encounter Christians, you'd encounter Jews, you'd encounter Zoroastrians. You'd encounter some Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians on the peninsula as well, in the Hijaz. But among those religious folk of the pre-Islamic period, especially important for early Islam, were a group of individuals known as the Hanifs, or the Hanifaya, plural, singular, Hanif, H-A-N-I-F, transliterated, plural, Hanifaya. The Hanifaya identified themselves as the followers of Allah, the God. They recognized the existence of these other deities, but they said, we do not worship them, we worship only Allah. So it starts sounding like Tawheed, or the monotheism of Islam. We might look to that. Oh, and this guy, this gentleman, nicely behind bars, was Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb was a Muslim scholar from Egypt and political activist who urged the overthrow of the Sadat government, the Western-backed government in Egypt in the 1960s. You can see his death date in 1966 when he was executed by the Egyptian government for trying to incite an assassination attempt on Anwar Sadat, who was later assassinated after signing the Camp David Accords with Israel. He wrote a book called Milestones, and in his book Milestones, he claimed that Western-backed or Soviet-backed Arab governments were not truly Islamic governments, And in fact, that Muslims in the 1950s and 60s and the post-colonial period were living in a period he called Jahiliyyah, a period of ignorance. And he called for the true Islamic revolution to overthrow these Western-backed Arab and other Middle Eastern governments. That structure I showed you before was standing at the time of the Jahiliyyah. It is the Kaaba in Mecca, transliterated K-A-B-B-A-H, the Kaaba. By tradition, the Kaaba in Mecca was built by Abraham and his son, what's his name? No, not that one. His firstborn.
Oh, Ishmael?
Ishmael. If you remember the story, go back to Bible class. Abraham has wife Sarah. Abraham can't have kids, so Sarah says, "Here, take my my handservant, Hagar. Lay with her. Have a child, and it'll be ours." And he goes like, "Oh, okay." So they have a child, a son, Ishmael. And then Sarah gets pregnant again with Isaac and says, "Get that floozy and her bastard son out of here." And in the Bible story, Hagar and Ishmael go off and they live happily among the people that become the Phoenicians or the Philistines, I forget which. But in Muslim tradition and pre-Islamic Arabian tradition, Hagar and Ishmael come down to the Hijaz. And they end up in Mecca. They're cared for by angels. And every now and then, Abraham, like a good divorced father, comes and visits on weekends and builds, together with his son Ishmael, a shrine to Allah. Now, by the time that the Quraysh came to power, the shrine itself became the keystone of their power. Because what they did is they filled the interior of the shrine with statues of all the various deities they could think of. By rumor, there was even a statue of the Virgin Mary to appease Christians. And so that shrine, built by Abraham and his son Ishmael, became the foundation of Quraysh power. It's the reason that the trade caravan routes would go away from the coast and up to the hill country, up to the hill country to Mecca with these 200 deities. Now today, when Muslims go to Mecca to pray at the Kaaba or during the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage, you pray by circumambulating, walking counterclockwise around the shrine itself. You don't enter the shrine. And then outside the shrine, in circles, you end up bowing and praying to the shrine. The Kaaba marks the center point, or the axis mundi for Muslims, the connection between our realm and heaven. It is the point on the globe that all Muslims should try to pray towards when possible. However, in pre-Islamic Arabian times, you went to the shrine, you paid money to the keeper of the keys, a specially designated, esteemed member of the Quraysh tribe who lived next to the Kaaba. He would let you in the shrine, close the door after you for privacy. Once in the shrine, you would remove your robes, get down to your skivvies, and according to tradition, lay down on the floor where there was a small piece of metal, piece of iron sticking out of the floor. You would lay with your belly button over that piece of iron in supplication to all of these deities, these 200 plus or so deities at one time. So that was a powerful religious experience for pre-Islamic Arabs, and clearly something that would take you off the coast to go into the hills to go and worship at this space. One final component that was significant in pre-Islamic Arab culture and was inescapable in early Islam was that this was an largely illiterate oral culture. It was an oral tradition that verses, poetry, came to be one of the most significant ways of communicating ideas, sharing history, and expressions of creativity in these communities on the Hijaz. Verses became important and wrapped up in the identities of tribal groups. The poets sang songs that transmitted the history of their tribes, sang of their great warriors, sang of their great victories, sang of the greatness of their tribe. In fact, there are accounts in Muslim tradition of pre-Islamic Arabian tribes going out to war, to conflict, and standing on the battlefield, arraying before their enemy. And each tribe would send out their best poet or poets for an epic poetry slam. And if your poet of your tribe was so good, and his words so beautiful, notice I keep saying his, because we are dealing with patriarchal culture, and we'll get to that in a moment. If I kept saying, so I'm going to keep saying his, but his words were so beautiful, so good, that they could inspire and rally your forces and make your enemies kind of, oh man, he did it so well, our poet sort of sucked. Kind of a morale issue for you. So poets become important. Poets become an important means of communicating truth and history and beauty. And that's where we end up finding a little more about the poet, because the poet was called the Sahir. The Sahir was someone who knew things, meaning the poet might have had the whisperings of angels in his ears. He might have heard things from Allah that other people did not know. And of course, the poet was also supposed to be a sharp social critic of his community. And many scholars have argued that when Muhammad started his prophetic career, there were two sources that he drew on for how to be a prophet for this new religion. One, poets. Two, the Hebrew prophets.